have any of you guys ever seen or heard of the show called Louie, about comedian Louis C.K. at all? It's rather hilarious. There's one episode that I saw that wasn't quite hilarious, but it really stuck with me for some reason. Imagine Louis as a little kid. It was him remembering what it was like when he was going to this Catholic school growing up. He tells a story about he was in the back of the classroom messing around with one of his friends because they were like elementary school, junior hires, and that's kind of what those age guys do. They mess around. Incredibly bright kids, but there's a lot of messing around right there, and that's okay. But they're messing around, and this nun is trying to teach them on the crucifixion of Jesus, the death of Jesus on a cross. But she hears them whispering, she hears them telling jokes, and she just comes to the conclusion, I'm failing at my job. I'm not showing you the sacrifice that Jesus did. I gotta fix this. So she goes and she gets this doctor friend of hers to come and teach the class the next day. And gets one of the boys who was joking around with Louis, has him stand up and demonstrates, not actually because that's child abuse, demonstrates what Jesus went through on the cross. Just saying all the different medical terms, all the different areas of pain that he went through, talking about the effects of some of these things, like the crown of thorns and all these things, and grueling details tells them about the death of Jesus. And then they invite Louis to come up, who was joking with this kid, and hands him a hammer and some nails. And imagine this, the doctor squats down next to Louis and says, finish it. Nail him to a cross. Do it. Just keeps repeating that word, do it. Louis standing there, hammer and nails in his hand. Do it. Do it. Why aren't you doing it? Points back to a crucifix, a statue of Jesus on a cross, and says, you had no problem putting him on a cross, why don't you do it here? Do it. And then he walks out without saying anything else. Next scene is Louis at bed that night, and all these images flashing through his head, everything that he's ever done wrong, every sin, contrasted with these images of the doctor, of these things that he saw as happening to Jesus, and it torments him. He ends up running into that church that night, yelling, I'm sorry! I'm sorry! And he goes up to the crucifix of Jesus on a cross, and he takes Jesus down off the cross. I'm sorry! And he holds him. It's okay. It's okay. It tormented him. I think of when I was a freshman in high school, this movie came out that you guys might know called The Passion of the Christ. Around that time, we had a bunch of sermons like this. Not so much there was an old guy kneeling next to me telling me to nail a friend to the cross or anything like that, but these sermons of the physical effects that Jesus went through on the cross, the medical conditions, and all that stuff. And all the entire point of these sermons were, look what Jesus had to go through to make up for what you did. Look at what had to happen because of your sins. I was a freshman in high school, and it tormented me. It hit me as hard as, maybe not as hard as Louis, but it hit me really hard. I saw that movie, I saw The Passion, and I don't think I said another word for the rest of the night. It was deep. It was hard. Around that time, an episode of a rather famous cartoon came out that was talking about the Passion, talking about why we think about the death of Jesus. This cartoon has a moral at the end of every story, and the moral they came to, not Christians by any means, they came to this conclusion of, why do we focus on the death of Jesus? We should just focus on his life. We should just focus on his teachings. Focusing on the death of Jesus is what they did in the Dark Ages, and that led to some horrible results. That's their conclusion. So the question I ask them is, why do we focus on the death of this man? Why do we focus on the physical pain that he went through? Well, to answer that, I think it's important to note that as we're continuing our series on Mark, we get to this section on the death of Jesus, on the last week of Jesus, and it's about a third of the entire book. The last week of Jesus is a third of the Gospel of Mark. So regardless of what we say, it seems like the Gospel writers want us to focus on this a little bit. That's why they made it so long. Even Mark, who compacts stories all the time, where it's like, wow, we're just rushing through this, aren't we? Immediately. We get to this section, and though it's a little bit compacted, it's still a third of the book. There's something going on here. And especially when we think of these ideas that we've been seeing so far. Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane before he gets arrested. He says, Father, if possible, take this cup from me. But not my will, but yours be done. What's this cup? Why is it put here? I think it's important to see the death of Jesus through this cup, and we're gonna talk about that in a little bit. But regardless, it seems like there is some purpose of this death, this crucifixion. And it's that purpose that we want to figure out. And to figure that out, we're going to answer this question of why did Jesus go to the cross? Why did he take this cup? To answer that, we're going to be in Mark chapter 15, verses 16 through 47. I didn't write down the page. I think it's 554. Is that right? Thank you. So on the Bibles that we have in the back, or the blue and white ones that sit in your lap, it's on page 554. For those of you who have your own Bibles or /phones, it's on Mark chapter 15. Sorry, I don't have the number for you guys. Starting at 16. Mark chapter 15, starting at verse 16. So we're answering this question of why did Jesus go to the cross? And the first thing that we see on his path to the cross is all this ridicule that he's facing. Where Jesus is about to go to his death, and he gets lampooned by all these other people. He gets named the sham of a king. And we see that starting in verse 16. It says this, and the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the governor's headquarters. And they called together a whole battalion, and they clothed him in a purple cloak. And twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him. And they began to salute him. Hail, King of the Jews! They were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him, kneeling down in homage to him. And they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak, put his own clothes on him, and led him out to crucify him. So we see that Jesus gets arrested for leading this insurrection of the Jews, for being called the King of the Jews. But the Jews are the ones who turn him in to be arrested. So the Romans are just like, what a king you are, even your own people don't follow you. And so they make fun of him. They make him out to be the sham of a king. They dress him up in like a mockery of what Caesar, the king of the entire land, would have worn in that day. He wears this purple rag thing instead of beautiful linen robes with a beautiful purple cloak. He gets a crown of thorns instead of that sweet leaf thing that Julius wears on our bottle of Caesar salad dressing. He gets mocked. It's said, where is your following? Do you feel royal now? Let's put it in modern language. It's as if we grabbed Jesus and we put him in this shabby blue sport coat. We gave him a full Windsor knot out of barbed wire, and we had him stand next to a cardboard cutout of Joe Biden. And we said, "Oh, Mr. President, can I shake your head? Could you kiss my baby?" They're mocking him. They're turning this entire thing on. On his way to the cross, Jesus faces ridicule. Then we get to the death itself. The crucifixion, where Jesus walks out with a cross, and he gets nailed to a cross as well. We pick that up in the next section, starting in verse 21. It says this, and they compelled the passerby Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. They offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. They crucified him and divided his garment amongst them, casting lots for them to decide what each should take. And at the third hour they crucified him. The inscription of the charge read against him, the King of the Jews. And with him they crucified two robbers, one on his right, one on his left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads, saying, "Aha! You who destroyed the temple, rebuild it in 3 days. Save yourself. Come down from the cross." So also the chief priests and the scribes mocked him, saying to one another, saying, "He saved others. He cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified him also. One thing that I kind of note here is Mark doesn't really give us a whole lot of details of what's going on. don't get a portion where it's then he gets nailed to a cross, then this happens, then this happens. We get a verse that says, then they crucify him. Because, as I said, I've heard sermons that talk about the physical pain that Jesus went through, but for whatever reason, it doesn't seem like that's the big idea of this passage. It doesn't seem like that's what Mark and Jesus want us to get from this. That there's something else. So because there's very few details, I'm going to say very few details about what happened when Jesus died. I think it's important to some extent to look at what happened, but it's not the big idea. So I'll just say this. Jesus was in a lot of pain. This is even evident in the fact that he didn't carry his own cross, which you were supposed to do in those days. They had to get someone else to do it. He was not physically able to carry his cross. And then he died. There's a lot of pain involved, and I don't think I need to go into details. But one thing that I think is important is he turns down this wine mixed with myrrh. Remember that in there? He had the ability to drink this wine, and really that's one of the best painkillers of the day. This could have dulled it. This could have made it a much more, not enjoyable, but sort of time. He could have gone easy, but he turned it down. You might remember at the Lord's Supper, he says at the end of it, I will not drink from the fruit of the vine until I'm in God's kingdom. So even before this happens, he predicted that he was going to turn this down. Well, one thing that I find interesting, one thing that makes me think that this is not about the pain, is we see Lord's Supper where he says, not going to drink wine. Then we see Garden of Gethsemane where he says, God, please take this cup from me if possible. If he already knows that he's not going to take painkillers, why would he be in the garden saying, let this physical pain not happen? Does that make sense? I don't think it's about the physical pain at all. He could have taken the wine. He could have had a much easier time. But instead, for some reason, for something else, he says, take this away from me. The cup is not the physical pain. He was never afraid of dying. He was worried about something else. And it's that cup that he was terrified of. It's that cup that he takes on the cross. It's that cup that puts him in more pain than the physical pain. We're going to see this in this passage. And so this. And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of the bystanders hearing it said, behold, he's calling Elijah. Quick editorial note. Eloi sounds a lot like Elijah, because Eloi is my God. Elijah means my God is Yahweh. You see how those are the same? Plus, they also thought Elijah was going to come and do some sweet stuff with the Messiah. So that's why they're like, oh, let's do some awesome stuff. That's what's going on there. So instead of you guys sitting there, why is he talking about Elijah? Now you know. And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, not from grapes or anything like that. That's a vinegar thing. And put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink, saying, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come and take him down. And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. This is the cup. It's not his death. It's not the pain that he's going through, but the cup happens here. Because it's this cup that he was afraid of more than anything else. Let's imagine this cup. What I want you to do, let's imagine a literal cup. Think of a literal cup. It could be, I don't know, a plastic cup, a sippy cup, a goblet of fire, whatever you want it to be. Imagine a literal cup. This cup is going to represent all of God's wrath towards anything whatsoever. What do we see in Genesis 1 when it says God created the earth? He called it what? Good. Good. So if it's good, does he need to have a full cup at all? No. He has no wrath towards anything. Even before the creation, you have God, who's a Trinity, in 3 parts, in perfect relationship with itself. We don't fully get how that works together, but there's one God with 3 persons in the Trinity. They have perfect relationship with itself. Does he need to have wrath in perfect relationship? No. So in the beginning, God had a cup, and it was empty. But then man came, and man chose to sin, chose to go against God, and the cup was filled to the brim. God had wrath towards his creation. When the first evil, when the first thing wrong, when the first bad thing ever happened in the world, God's cup was filled to capacity. Because He is so good, He is so perfect, He is so holy, set apart, and anointed, that when there is badness, that it just causes a huge separation between Him and sin. Think of it as flipping the magnet around. When sin comes into the world, the magnet gets repelled instead of attracted. That's what happened when sin came into the world. And more than that, because man chose to rebel against God, because man said, I'm going to do things my way. Thanks anyways, God. Because they said that, God had wrath towards them. Because they did a crime against Him. We don't get mad at a judge for punishing a criminal, right? Like that's kind of his job to do that. When someone commits a crime, there needs to be punishment for there to be justice in the world. In the same way, when we all sin against God, we need punishment for there to be justice in the world. But more than that, every single day we choose to go against God. Every single day we give God more reasons to give us wrath. I don't know how a cup filled to the brim can hold more wrath in it, but somehow we've made that possible. And I know every moment and every part of my day, I am causing more things that need God's wrath. This was my cup. This was our cup when we were supposed to drink. Now, we know that God is loving, and so the question comes, how can God lovingly give this severe, this harsh punishment to people? Well, I want us to think about it this way. That same judge who punishes the criminal. Think about it if he just let the criminal who commits a crime and he's like, yeah, dude, I totally did that crime. The judge lets him go. We would be outraged. We'd say, Judge, you can't do that. Your job is to punish people. For there to be justice, for things to be good, for there to be things that are right. Crimes need a punishment, and we are crime committers. That is what we do. So we have a cup. We've earned it. This is God's wrath, and we're supposed to take it. But Jesus takes it for us. On the cross, this cup, this God's wrath, Jesus takes it for us. This is completely unique. He was in perfect relationship with God before the creation of the world. He's never had to experience God's wrath, and he gets all of it. All of it. Every bit of wrath Jesus takes on the cross. It was this, not the physical pain that Jesus was tormented over in the garden. It is this, not the physical pain that caused Jesus to pray for its removal. This is the cup. This is what he takes. And so you think that I'm not just making it up. I want us to focus on something right here. Jesus has been silent for most of this entire ordeal. He was on trial. He was silent. He goes before Pilate. He's silent. And then we get this one phrase. My God, why are you forsaking me? I think it's said so we look at it so we can understand what's going on. Because otherwise it's just Jesus on a cross and then we're stuck wondering, is this him taking the cup or is he just getting arrested and being killed for causing, outrage and all that stuff? What's going on here? But Jesus says this phrase, I think, so that we can get a window into what's going on. Because you might know this. My God, why are you forsaking me? Has been said before. It was said in Psalm 22, verse 1 by David. And so, when we see this, as the original audience members like, hey, I know that passage. Let's go back to Psalm 22. And then we turn back. We're not going to turn back. I'll just read from the screen. It's much easier. But they would turn back and they would look at what's going on in this psalm and see Jesus is alluding to this passage. Jesus is saying, this is happening now. Because in that psalm, we see the righteous suffer. Someone who follows God say, my God, why have you forsaken me? In verse 1. Where he's going through real pain, actual pain. God never diminishes pain. But he's going through this. And yet, despite that, he realizes the goodness of God. He realizes that God is holy and just, and he can still be trusted. We see, this is verses 3 through 5. Yet you are holy, talking about God, enthroned on the praises of Israel. And you are fathers trusted. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried and were rescued. And you they trusted and were not put to shame. Despite the pain, I still trust God. Why? Because he makes all things good. Because he restores all things. This is how Psalm 22 ends. All the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship before you. For kings kingship belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. This is the removal of the cup. When Jesus is up there, he says, Psalm 22, verse 1. And so we go back and we see, when we get to the end, and we see this is what he's leaning towards. All people, all times, relationship with God. Jesus takes the cup that was supposed to be ours. And instead of a cup, we get a house. And this is the effect. This is the result of what happened. All people at all times can have a relationship with God. There is no longer anything that comes between us and God. We can go directly to him because Jesus takes the cup that was supposed to be ours. That's what happened. We see that in the next couple verses. Where it says this. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, truly, this man was the Son of God. A lot of cool stuff happens here. I'm sorry, I get a little excited about it. So we see a curtain getting torn, a split veil. What's going on with that? I'm going to tell you right now. So in the temple, there was a section called the Holy of Holies, where God's presence specially resided, where Israel could say, yes, we have God because he's there. But the temple had this curtain that separated that from everything else. So when this rips, when this is no longer a symbol as the rest of the world and the Holy of Holies, we see this means God is everywhere now, right? This means God is putting his special presence everywhere. This means we can look everywhere and see we have God to relate to. We don't just have to go to a little room. We have the earth because the veil is split. That sounds a lot like the end of Psalm 22. Just show that this actually happened. We have this Roman centurion, this Gentile, this guy who had nothing to do with God, this guy who did not get raised reading the Old Testament. He had none of that stuff. And he looks at Jesus and he says, this is the Son of God. People are just like, oh, he's just saying Jesus was really cool. He's some sweet guy. But it's important. This is the last title ever given to Jesus in the book of Mark. And not just that, but what was the first title we ever saw given to Jesus in the book of Mark? Mark 1, verse 1. The gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The ending of Jesus' life takes us back to the beginning and says, this is the Son of God. This is God, and he has made all things right. The ending of Psalm 22, when Jesus references on the cross, it says, all the ends of the earth will turn to the Lord, and this is happening now. We see it with the veil split. We see it with the Gentiles saying the Son of God. Jesus takes the cup, the result of which is all people, all times, have access to God. Huge. We move into the next part, just for the sake of time we're not going to deal with, but there's a temporary burial that happens, where Jesus is put into a tomb until Sunday morning. Right? It's a great passage. It goes from verse 40 to 47. I recommend you read it, especially with this time coming up, where Joseph of Arimathea goes and gets Jesus' body and puts him in a tomb until he's resurrected on Sunday. That's the ending of this passage. But we see all this amazing stuff happen before that. The question we started that came from it is, why do we focus on the death of this man? Why don't we just focus on his life, his teaching? There's great stuff in his teaching. It kind of tells us how to live. A lot of people respect his teaching. Why do we have to worry about this whole death stuff? It's because that's the certainty that we're saved. With Jesus dying, that's the assurance that we are right with God. That's the assurance that we have access to God. This is certainty. There's nothing more that you have to do. You don't have to do any special work. You don't need to go out and try to be at one with the entire world. You don't have to try to escape the bonds of this physical world. You don't need to try and escape the cycle of reincarnation. You don't need to try to find your inner God. You don't need to try to work really hard to make this world a better and better place. You don't have to do some ritual. You don't have to do any type of thing to be better. You know why? In every single one of those systems, in all of those things, you can never do enough. There's no certainty in that. There's always one more ritual, one more reincarnation cycle, One more this, one more that, one more weed I have to plant to make this world better. One more forever. There's no certainty in that. God does not want his creation to sit around and wonder, am I saved? Am I saved? Is God okay with me? Is this all right? He does not want that from you. Instead, he comes as God through a man. As God, as a man, to take this cup that should have been ours. We had wrath. We're all fallen. We all need punishment because we all committed crimes constantly. And Jesus comes and takes that cup from our hands and downs the entire thing. There's not even a sip left if you wanted to drink from it. There's nothing you can do because everything has already been done. There's an old document called the Heidelberg that asks this awesome question. How am I right with God? And it has this beautiful answer. Only by true faith in Jesus Christ. Even though my conscience accuses me of having grievously sinned against all God's commandments, and of never having kept any of them. And even though I'm still inclined towards all evil, nevertheless, without my deserving it at all, out of sheer grace, God grants and credits to me the perfect satisfaction, righteousness, and holiness of Christ. As if I had never been a sinner, if I had never sinned nor been a sinner. As if I had been perfectly obedient as Christ was obedient for me. All I need to do to accept this is to accept this gift of God with a believing heart. That is certainty. There's nothing more that you have to do. This is why we focus on the death of Jesus. It's because in it we see that this is how we know we are right with God. There's no speculation. There's no wondering. It's just Jesus does this for us and we are right with God if we accept it. That's why we focus here. A cup meant for us that's taken away. But please hear this. The cross is not something that you did to Jesus. Jesus doesn't go and he takes this pain. He doesn't take the cross because of something that you did to him. The cross is not something that you did to Jesus. The cross is something that Jesus does for you. That is certainty. That is grace. That is the gospel. That is why we focus on Jesus. That is why we had an entire series in Mark. Because we had wrath in store for us, but Jesus takes that from us upon himself and says, you are mine. You can have access to me. You can be saved.